policy under Trump differed from the usual approach in all of the traditional systems. Trump's policy was characterized by the explicitly and boldness, the most prominent of which was the cancellation of the nuclear agreement with Iran and economic pressure on it through economic sanctions that affected the ruling circle and those who supported it. Besides, he issued unprecedented executive orders for several countries, not allowing them to enter the states under the pretext of fighting terrorism. Countries allied with the Trump's administration in the region became the arbitrators, as is happening in Yemen, from the regional conflict between the Houthi militia supported by Iran and the legitimacy supported by the Saudi Emirati coalition. According to a statement by the United Nations World Food Programme, about 100,000 children under 5 are at risk of starvation. 6 years of exhausting war and the most significant famine in modern history. The impact of Biden's win on changing the current situation will be the axis of our conversation today, with John Duke Anthony, the founding president and executive director of the National Council for American Arab Relations, and with Khalid al-Yemani, a politician and former ambassadors to the United Nations and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Yemen. Abdurrahman al-Ma'mari, a researcher and Yemeni affairs specialist, will provide the translations after Mr. Anthony finished his speech. السياسة الأمريكية الخارجية في عهد ترامب كان لها مسار خاص اختلف عن النهج المألوف في كل السياسات المشهودة. سياسة ترامب اتسمت بالوضوح والجرأة التي لم تخضع لأي مساحيق تجميل. كان أبرزها إلغاء الاتفاق النووي مع إيران والضغط الاقتصادي عليها من خلال العقوبات الاقتصادية التي طالت الدائرة الحاكمة ومن يدعمها، إلى إصدار أوامر تنفيذية غير مسبوقة لعدة دول تم منع مواطنيها كافة من دخول الولايات المتحدة، كما تم إعاز الشؤون المتأزمة في المنطقة لعدة دول أخرى متحالفة مع الإدارة الحالية، كما يحصل في اليمن من الصراع الإقليمي بين الحوثي المدعوم من النظام الإيراني والشرعية المدعومة من التحالف السعودي الإماراتي. 6 سنوات من الحرب المنهكة وأكبر مجاعة في التاريخ الحديث بحسب بيان لبرنامج الغذاء العالمي التابع للأمم المتحدة، أن حوالي 100,000 طفل ما دون سن ال5 معرضون لخطر موت جوعان. التطلعات إلى إدارة الرئيس المنتخب جو بايدن في تغيير السياسة المنتهية ولايتها والغير مجدية للشعب اليمني وتأثير فوزه على مجريات الحرب في اليمن ستكون محور حديثنا اليوم مع السيد جون دوك أنتوني، الرئيس المؤسس والمدير التنفيذي للمجلس الوطني للعلاقات الأمريكية العربية، ومع السيد خالد اليماني، سياسي وسفير سابق لدى الأمم المتحدة ووزير خارجية سابق لليمن. الترجمة مقدمة من السيد عبد الرحمن المعمري، باحث ومتخصص في الشأن اليمني، وستكون مباشرة بعد انتهاء الدكتور أنتوني من حديثه. وقبل أن نبدأ هذه الندوة وذهاب للضيوف، أرحب بالسيد حسام اليافعي، أحد أعضاء مركز واشنطن للدراسات اليمنية. سيد حسام، تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. قبل أن نبدأ اسمحوا لي أن أقدم لكم بالنيابة عن مركز واشنطن للدراسات اليمنية، يشرفني أن أرحب بالدكتور جون دوك أنتوني والأستاذ خالد اليماني والصحفية المتألقة كنان الشريف التي ستدير حوارنا لليوم. يسعد المركز أن يرحب بجميع الحاضرين كلا باسمه وصفته. معلومات عن خلفية عن المركز نفسه. مهمة المركز هي إنتاج الدراسات والتقارير ذات درجة عالية من الاحتراف والنزاهة ومشاركتها مع المختصين في الشؤون اليمنية من مختلف الجوانب السياسية، الإنسانية والثقافية. أهداف المركز تتمثل بإجراء بحوث والدراسات والتقارير في مختلف المجالات، المشاركة في الندوات والدراسات المتعلقة بالشأن اليمني، التشبيك والتعاون مع المراكز والمعاهد المتخصصة في الشأن اليمني، توثيق كافة الدراسات والتقارير التي يمكن الحصول عليها عن اليمن، تنمية ثقافة الدراسات والبحوث والخدمات الاستشارية في الشأن اليمني. ولا أنسى شكري لكل المتعاونين مع المركز بكافة مجالاته. On behalf of the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies, I would like to invite you all and welcome you all, and first of all introduce our guest speakers as they have been previously introduced. Dr. John Duke Anthony, the founding president and the chief executive officer of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Ustad Khalid al-Yemani, a Yemeni politician and the former foreign minister and ambassador to the United Nations and our great journalist, Kanana Sharif, who will be moderating the event for today. Just to give you some background about the center, the vision is to be one of the main sources and references for researchers and those interested in Yemeni affairs in order to provide a wider support for the democratic process that we're trying to create again. Our message is to produce a highly professional and impartial studies and reports and share them with specialists in the Yemeni affairs in various aspects, be it political, humanitarian, or cultural. Our objectives are represented in these values: conducting research, studies, and reports in various fields, participating in seminars and studies related to Yemeni affairs, networking and collaborating with other centers and institutes specialized in Yemeni affairs, documenting all obtainable studies and reports on Yemen, developing the culture of studies, research and consulting services in Yemeni affairs. And before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to welcome you all and express my personal gratitude for attending and expressing interest in a topic that is getting lost in the storm of the global events, from US elections to COVID-19 to what have you, for getting such a vital issue such as the Yemeni conflict. And last but not least, and obviously I would like to express my gratitude to our generous sponsors who continue to make this work possible. Thank you very much.
شكرا حسام. طبعا في نهاية الحديث لا تنسوا المشاركين أن تضعوا الأسئلة في صندوق المحادثة أو إرسال رسائل لأي سؤال متعلق بالندوة. سنبدأ الآن. Dr. Anthony, we will start with you. Thank you so much for being with us today. You can start.
Unmute yourself, please. You're on mute.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Can you hear me? What would you like for me to say or do?
Yes, we hear you.
What would you like for me to do?
Can you please, just if you heard the introduction, if you please tell us about the impact of Biden's wins on the Yemen policies. Is going to be any different in the new policies, let's say, in Yemen with Biden administration?
Yes, you'd like for me to speak for what, 5 minutes, 8 minutes? Because you have other speakers, right?
10 to 15 minutes, please, if you.
Okay, all right.
Enough for you.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Yes, all right. With regard to, can you see me?
Yes.
Good.
We see you and hear you very clearly. Thank you.
All right, that's great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your supporters and organizers. You've got a very important topic, and you're providing a great public service nationally for the Yemeni people first and foremost, but for the many majority of outsiders who've never been to Yemen and do not see it from the inside, but rather see it, unfortunately, through the lens of others, through the lens of the United States, perceived interest, understandable interest, or looking through the lens of Riyadh and Saudi Arabia and its needs, its concerns and interests, and looking at it also through the lens of Tehran. This is unfortunate. It's also not new. It's been standard now for decades, unfortunately for the people of Yemen. Now, with regard to the Biden administration's win, there are the following things to be concerned about in contrast with the Trump administration of 4 years. One would be that there is not going to be the cozy relationship between the principal players on the outside in the White House, they being Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh and his relationship with Jared Kushner, and Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi and his relationship with Jared Kushner as well through his ambassador here in Washington, D.C. There's nothing remotely comparable between any of Yemen's leaders or would-be leaders and anybody on the Biden team. This is unfortunate. because it means that outsiders are having to deal with these issues. And the outsiders overwhelmingly do not speak the language of the Yemeni people, overwhelmingly have never set foot in Yemen, overwhelmingly have not read in depth, taken academic courses or done research and studies in separate publications on Yemen. What this means is that it renders Yemen as an object. All countries are objects in the eyes of others, objects to be courted or made into allies or supporters or friends or strategic partners. That's understandable. This has been the case ever since Adam and Eve first partook of the apple in the garden. So this is rooted in human affairs since time immemorial. But what it misses is that Yemen is more than an object, it's an actor. It's an actor with people having their own legitimate needs, their own legitimate concerns, their own legitimate interests, their own legitimate analyses, their own legitimate foreign policy goals. And when you do not have the requisite empathy, you can have sympathy, hopefully not antipathy, and the situation will not allow apathy, but it does necessitate the moral imperative of empathy. For Biden supporters, himself and his advisors, to be able to, as much as humanly possible, project themselves into the shoes, souls, and situations of the Yemeni people. The Yemeni people cry out for peace. They cry out for security. They cry out for stability. They cry out for the prospects for prosperity. And these are legitimate needs. There's a moral component and context for this, and there's a factual one for this, and there's especially a humanitarian imperative for this. Now, all of these things will come into focus and have their respective priorities under the Biden administration. So you can predict and prepare and anticipate that Yemen will be near the top of the Biden administration's foreign policy priorities. It won't necessarily be at the top, but let's just say it'll be in the top 5 or 3. Because President-elect Biden proclaimed in a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations, of which I've been a member since 1986, he's made references to Saudi Arabia being a pariah. He's made references to wanting to reassess America's relationships with Saudi Arabia. He's pointed out that he will not stand for or tolerate selling arms to countries without a consideration also for the uses to which those arms may be put, legitimate offensive ones or defensive ones. And in either case, a respect for and a concern for the human rights conditions and abuses in the country receiving such arms. So this has been a campaign pledge and promise. It's also a platform in the Democratic Party's positions of what would be their foreign policy priorities. Now, the cautionary note here is to be careful what one wishes for, because under the current situation, American support for the Saudi Arabian and to a lesser degree United Arab Emirates intervention, intrusion into Yemeni affairs has been mixed in its achievements. And from a moral humanitarian focus, it's been disastrous. Because of attacks on the civilian infrastructure and the so-called collateral, which is a very ambiguous, confusing term, collateral damage on the civilian population of Yemen, and the understaffed, under-equipped, under-experienced, under-trained, under-educated healthcare service sector in the Yemeni population, which has meant that foreign economic and humanitarian aid to the country has had to, of necessity, from reality, have to pass through the hands of the Houthi government in Sana'a. And what this means is that not all of the aid will be received by the intended recipient. This is tragic. This is a moral disaster. On the other hand, it's difficult to see how one can get any aid to those in need without going through the appropriate authorities. This is a reality. You cannot do it otherwise. But what this entails is that the Houthis will seize the humanitarian aid and siphon however much of it off to themselves for their own purposes. What purposes? One, to recruit more people to its ranks, those who are destitute, who are desperate, and who have been dispossessed and who are devastated. This puts people in a psychological mood of survival and a willingness to do just about anything in order to survive, not just for themselves, but more importantly for their families, their loved ones, their acquaintances and relations. So much of the aid goes to the Houthis, and they use it for this purpose. A second use to which they put it is to retain members of their ranks so that they will not defect, they will not desert the Houthi cause. And so this strengthens the Houthis rather than weakens them. And then thirdly, the Houthis can use it on the so-called black market. If they have need for monies themselves, they can sell it at inflated prices or inflationary prices, because they know that the purchaser of these goods will do anything and will pay anything possible to receive such aid. So this is a tragic consequence of the unresolved conflict in Yemen. Everyone agrees that there can be no military victory or settlement to this. It must be a political settlement. And in Yemen's favor, it is that it is not bereft of leaders. Yemen has an extraordinary number of leaders who are capable, who are educated, who are trained, who have the background, who have the perspective, who are familiar with the context and have the relevant experience on the ground of leading large numbers of people. Many countries cannot say that, but Yemen can. And note that you had the national dialogue amongst all the actors and parties and activists in the Yemeni conflict that lasted more than a year, with more than 500 participants representing every single participant, player, and activist group in the Yemeni conflict. Name another country that's been able to do something like that. This is almost without precedent in contemporary history. So this does not make it into the media very much, but it is a kind of hopeful sign that the leaders are there, but the policies being directed from the outside, filtered from the outside, being run through the context and the lens of the interests and needs and concerns and objectives of outsiders, rather than through the needs, concerns, interests, and objectives of the Yemeni people, is a guaranteed recipe for disastrous negative consequences. For example, if the goal is, as the administration, both the Trump administration and to a lesser degree, but an important degree, the Biden campaign as well, by cutting off arms to Saudi Arabia, that there is an assumption that this will help to end the conflict in Yemen. I don't think anything could be further from the truth there. What is nearer to the truth by doing this is it would be a hadiyah, a great gift to the Iranians, because the Iranians would have the field to themselves. And especially if, as the administration in its last weeks before the change in regimes in the United States in January, has its way of declaring the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, this will add to the existing sanctions on the Houthis, on Iran, and leave the field even more to the Iranians as an outsider than is already the case. Secondly, it will cripple or hinder the United States relationship with the principal armed forces coming in from the outside, namely the Saudi Arabians, in the following way, through intelligence gathering. there, which the Saudi Arabians are able to do to a greater degree than is the United States. Saudi Arabia is a next door neighbor. There are hundreds of thousands of Yemenis living and working in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has these as an asset, as a leverage, as a bargaining chip, so to speak. There's also the element of training and technological cooperations and scientific cooperation and patent cooperation with a view to strengthening the bonds of trust between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And trust can be everything. And it's just absolutely essential to achieving security. What more basic human and humanitarian need for any people is there than to have security so that people don't have to walk down the street looking over their shoulder to make sure that they can make it home safely from wherever they're going and hope to return. And without security, how can you have stability? You have to have stability in order for a government to have effective positions, effective policies, effective attitudes, actives on the ground. And without security and stability, you have almost zero prospects for peace. So these things are interlinked, interconnected here. If you sever the relationship with Saudi Arabia on the strategic military intelligence side of the equation, be careful what you wish for, because something may result that could worsen an already tragic situation rather than improve it. I don't know how many minutes of the 15 minutes you asked me to speak these are, but these are some points to consider that are not being considered. And if you just read the literature of what think tanks and advisors to the Biden campaign are advocating, it is to do these kinds of things that in the end of the day would be harmful. Now, where is this coming from? It's not just coming from Riyadh. And it's not just coming from the lens of Iran. It's coming from the 800-pound gorilla in the room, namely Israel. Since Israel's establishment in 1948 until the present time, Israel's worst nightmare is Saudi Arabia. That the United States and its relationship with Saudi Arabia may come to compete with the US marriage without a divorce to Israel. There's only one Israel, only one Turkey, only one Iran, but there are 22 Arab countries and Saudi Arabia by default, because Iraq is gone, Syria is gone, Egypt's gone. In terms of pan-Arab leadership, Saudi Arabia is the default leader of the 22 Arab countries. And likewise, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has 57 member countries. Israel's not a member of that. It's not a member of the League of Arab States. It's not a member of the GCC. It's not a member of OPEC or WAPEC or the Arab Monetary Fund or any of these organizations through which policies and strategies pertaining to war and peace, ending conflict and promoting security and stability are hammered out. And so the Israeli part of it sees this as a nightmare. Its strategic goal, which in my view is naive and self-destructive, is to isolate Saudi Arabia, to punish it, to keep it on the defensive, to keep it on its back feet, to absorb all of its energies in explaining its policies, trying to apologize or defend its policies, and making noises about punishing Saudi Arabia. All of this is to try to keep the Israeli relationship with the United States not only intact, but continuously strengthened and expanding. No one will mention this, but one of the services that your institute is providing is for people to speak frankly, truthfully, factually, and with a moral compass as a frame of reference here. So almost all of the US Congress feels beholden in one way or another to the interest of Israel. There are several hundred US organizations, nonprofit, so to speak, non-governmental, so to speak, that exist in large measure or certainly significant measures to promote the interests, the needs, and concerns of Israel. That this is not brought into the equation is unfortunate. It means that the United States is like a Siamese twin with Israel, and having policies and positions in the region that benefit Israel, but are of questionable needs and values with regard to the United States or the people on the ground. If you count from 1948 to the present time, there have been 11 wars or conflicts in the Middle East, Arab region, each one of which has a link to Israel's concerns and Israel's needs and Israel's objectives. This is tragic there. And in the long term, it's not good at all for Jewish interest or Israeli interest. And it harms Israel in the long term because it makes it a pariah, it makes it isolated, it puts Israel on the defensive, it denies Israel a chance to be on good, friendly terms with the Arab region and the nearly 2 billion Muslims of the planet. And Israel is a net non-beneficiary of that reality. So these are short-term transactional dynamics and policies that the United States is following heavily at the behest of what Israel wants, whether it's a Republican administration or Democratic administration. It has been almost a bipartisan recipe for disaster. Here you have Mr. Pompeo going to Israel in the last few days and going to one of the Israeli settlements there and insisting that no longer is Israel to be referred to as being an occupation of the Palestinian territories, but at most disputed territories. And also the United States recognition of Israel's occupation of the Golan province of Syria is the same, as bad or as worse. People refer to it as the Golan Heights, but this is misleading in the extreme. It's not just the heights. The heights are just a sliver, a tiny fraction of Syria. It's 2/3 of Golan's province that Israel has occupied. And this is Syria's richest agriculture and water asset-ridden province that the Israelis have seized. And for the United States to recognize that occupation, it's the only country in the world to do so, makes it laughable when the United States talks about legal rights, talks about international law, which is unadulterated BS, or talks about support for international order and organizations and a rules-based international system of interaction between countries. We Americans need to hold up a mirror to our face and ask ourselves, where are we with regard to that which we practice, which we preach? Do we practice it? Hardly. As I say, we are close to being the #1 violator of international law. Israel is the Olympic champion of the violators of international law and the norms of the United Nations Charter, which prohibit the acquisition of territory by force. So when the US preaches democratization and human rights and civil rights and gender rights in other countries, and nothing could be more hypocritical because these other countries can ask the United States, where are you in terms of you have more guns per capita than any of the great powers in the world, or more than all the great powers in the world. You have more people behind bars. 1/3 of all the people behind bars on the planet are behind bars in the United States. And an extraordinary, inordinate percentage of those who are in prison are Muslims there. And you have the United States with a so-called Muslim ban travel law that prohibits travel to and from the United States by 7 countries that have large percentages of their populations being Muslims. And look what this has done to families that cannot meet again for travel or tourism or vacation or just simple reunion. It's the United States that has done this. No other country has done this. And you read the Patriot Act following 9/11. If you read it once, it looks bland and innocuous. You read it closely a second time, and it's inescapable that it is directed at Arabs and directed at Muslims. So if this is not a racist, stereotypical branding of another people, an entire culture and civilization as being negative and deserving of punishment, it's hard to imagine what is. So there's a need for the United States to have an independent position and policies towards Yemen, and to try to find the face-saving formula to bring a political settlement to this conflict. And when one says, well, no, one cannot do this because the Houthi regime is so violent, it's a terrorist organ and extremist, etc. Well, the United States has done this over and over and over again, and so has Saudi Arabia. It was Saudi Arabia that in the Taif Accords pressed more Muslim participation in Lebanon's government. We can give a lot of examples. That's enough for now.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, the speech is really interesting, but we have limited time and we have questions at the end of this webinar. Now, before we go to Mr. Khalid Al-Yemani, Dr. Abdurrahman Al-Ma'mari will provide the translation. Dr. Abdurrahman Al-Ma'mari يقدم الترجمة لكلمة دكتور أنتوني. شكرا لحضرتك دكتور عبد الرحمن، تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا. السيد جون أنتوني تكلم عن عدة نقاط، سأحاول أن أختصر وأن أكون مركز كثيرا فيها. بدايته كان يتكلم أن أمريكا تنظر إلى اليمن ليس بمنظار مستقل، وإنما من خلال منظار أو من خلال عدسات السعودية وإيران أو عدسات الدول الأخرى تجاه الوضع في اليمن. كان يتكلم أيضاً أنه الإدارة السابقة لولاية الرئيس ترامب كانت المملكة العربية السعودية، خصوصاً الأمير محمد بن سلمان وكذلك محمد بن زايد في الإمارات، كانوا على علاقة جيدة مع مبعوث الشرق الأوسط كوشنر. لكن طبعاً كما يقول أن في فريق بايدن الجديد لسوء الحظ أن الكثير منهم غير مطلع على مستجدات الوضع في اليمن، ويعني لا يعرف ممكن الكثير عنها. وإذا ما كانت الكثير من الدول تعتبر كما يتكلم عنها هي عبارة عن أشياء وعبارة عن أماكن مختلفة، لكن اليمن في المنطقة يمكن النظر إليها كلاعب أساسي. ومع ذلك فنحن نشعر بالشفقة والأسى للوضع في اليمن، خصوصا الوضع الإنساني فيها، على الرغم من أن الشعب اليمني ينشد الاستقرار والرخاء والسلام، لكن هناك أزمة اقتصادية وإنسانية متفاقمة منذ بداية هذا الحرب. بالنسبة لليمن يتوقع أن تحتل اليمن ممكن قمة الأولويات بالنسبة لإدارة بايدن القادمة، ممكن تكون ضمن الأولويات الخمس أو الثلاث في قمة أولوياته في الشرق الأوسط. كما يقول بأن الوضع الحالي بإدارة الرئيس ترامب ودعمها للسعودية والإمارات وتصدير الأسلحة كانت نتيجته كارثية على الوضع في اليمن. وأيضا بالنسبة للوضع الإنساني والمساعدات التي تأتي إلى اليمن، فالحوثي كسلطة أمر واقع في مناطق نفوذه ومناطق سيطرته، فهو كثيرا ما يستقبل هذه المساعدات ولكنه يستخدمها لأغراضه الخاصة، والتي منها تجنيد المزيد من الأتباع، وكذلك استخدام هذه المواد الإغاثية والإنسانية وبيعها في السوق السوداء لمزيد من الإيرادات لهذه الجماعة. بالنسبة للتسوية، هو يرى أن التسوية القادمة هي لن تكون تسوية عسكرية، هي تسوية سياسية. الشعب اليمني هناك العديد من القيادات الاستثنائية أصحاب التجربة والخبرة والقادرين على إحداث تغيير أكيد وحقيقي في اليمن، فاليمن لا تنقصه أزمة قيادات كما يقول، ممكن وهذه نقطة إيجابية لليمن على كثير من الدول الأخرى. لكن الإشكالية الأساسية أن السياسة في اليمن هي مرسومة من الخارج وليست نابعة من حاجات الشعب اليمني نفسه، ولذلك فهذه هي تكون ممكن النقطة السلبية الكبرى على الوضع في اليمن. تصدير ترامب للأسلحة في اليمن كما قال زادت الوضع سوءا وتعقيدا، فهذه الأسلحة تحولت وكأنها هدية في نهاية المطاف للحوثيين والإيرانيين التي استفادوا من وجودها سواء في إذكاء نار الحرب والصراع في اليمن. تكلم أن الأزمة في اليمن هي ليست أزمة محلية، وإنما هناك العديد من الدول الإقليمية هي أيضا مشاركة وذات أثر كبير جدا على الوضع في اليمن، وبتواري كثير من الدول المحورية مثل العراق وسوريا ومصر. برزت ممكن نقول كما يقول هو الاهتمام الأمريكي بالرغبات الإسرائيلية ونظرتها للوضع في الإقليم، ونتيجة للصراع السابق ما بين إسرائيل والسعودية والصراع الحالي ما بين إسرائيل وإيران، فهذه الصراعات سوف تنعكس على رؤية الولايات المتحدة وطريقة تقييمها وإعادة تقييمها للوضع في اليمن. وهذه الأمر من الأمور المتفق عليها، سواء كان من في البيت الأبيض ديمقراطيا أو جمهوريا، فمراعاة الاهتمام والمصالح الإسرائيلية هي تكون كما قال أمر متفق عليه عند جميع السياسيين في الولايات المتحدة، نظرا لوجود العديد وكما قال هناك المئات من المنظمات الغير حكومية الداعمة لإسرائيل والضاغطة على السياسيين الأمريكيين. تكلم يعني كثيرا على موضوع المطامع والمصالح الإسرائيلية في المنطقة ونظرتها، لكن في الأخير يقول أن الولايات المتحدة، ممكن ما نختم به هنا، أن الولايات المتحدة تحتاج إلى أن تكون لها سياسة مستقلة تجاه اليمن بعيدا عن مصالح ورغبات الدول الأخرى المختلفة. أشكركم كثيرا.
شكرا دكتور معمري. Thank you so much. Now we can start with Mr. خالد اليماني. سيد خالد اليماني، شكرا لتواجدك معنا. تفضل، تسمعني؟
نعم، شكرا. أتمنى أن تكونوا تسمعوني بشكل جيد.
نعم، نسمعك بشكل جيد. تفضل.
حسب الاتفاق مع الجهات المنظمة سأقدم المداخلة باللغة الإنجليزية، وهناك ترجمة أتطلع لأن توضع على الشاشة مباشرة.
ستوضع الترجمة على الشاشة على بشكل presentation PowerPoint.
مشكورين. Let me first of all thank the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies for inviting me to talk about the war in Yemen and the Biden administration. Also, I welcome Dr. John Duke Anthony, the founding president of the National Council for U.S.-Arab Relations, and Kinana Sharif, our moderator for today's event. Shukran, Kinana. Yemen, as you all know, is facing 6 years of civil war with regional implication. A few days ago, the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, launched an open appeal to the world, declaring that Yemen is now in imminent danger of a worst famine in the world, and has been in famine in the world, and that in absence of imminent action, millions of lives may be lost. This is the real picture of Yemen after 6 years of war, infectious diseases, poverty, starvation, and the lack of hope. It's a shame on humanity to see Yemenis agonizing and dying and do nothing or little or nothing to stop the war and help Yemenis recover from the ongoing crisis. To give you just a tiny picture of the war economy that is destroying everything in Yemen. The war economy in Yemen penetrates deeply into all aspects of Yemeni life, starting from the scarcity of food commodities, other necessary supplies such as medicine, oil, derivatives, and not ending with the food prices gauge due to the warlords looting of international relief goods to sell them in the public market. As Dr. John Duke just mentioned, this is and Dr. Besley from the World Food Program mentioned that several times, and lastly during the report to the Security Council 2 weeks ago. This has also exacerbated due to the government failure to provide such services to the population in various regions. In addition, the fact that the Houthis also demand the impoverished people in areas under their control to pay the so-called war efforts tax. The sharp division in the state institutions, especially banking institutions, is also a great driver of humanitarian suffering. Having two central banks dominated by the politics attached to the war has gravely affected the value of the national currency, with over 300% depreciation of the Yemeni rial against the US dollar since 2014 has caused millions of families to drop below the poverty line of $2 or maybe less than that per day. If the real value continues to deteriorate in this rate, coupled with the warlords' control of the black market, the primary goods, the 13 Yemenis supported today by the UN OCHA program in Yemen will double in a glance. Furthermore, if major donors fail to contribute to the UN humanitarian relief operations in Yemen, and this is what's happening today, because they failed, the UN plan or appeal for 2020 was 3.2 billion and only was financed by 1.2 billion, which is almost 1/3 of the request of the humanitarian relief operations for Yemen. So this drastic picture is if the donors are not contributing to the UN humanitarian relief operation, which is now the case, as I mentioned to you, the worst humanitarian crisis will unfortunately cross new threshold, leading to famine and maybe worse. Just to give you the picture of the finances of the country in this moment, the exclusive laws of cumulative GDP from 2014 to 2020 is estimated in the number of $90 billion. The losses in terms of state revenues from 2014 to 2020 are estimated $42.2 billion, including taxes and state revenues controlled today by the warlords. Thus, the government of Yemen is not able to constantly pay civil servant salaries in areas under the control, under its control, whilst Houthis continue to refuse to pay salaries to for the fifth year in row in their areas to teachers and doctors and the civil servant for their minimum right. The ability of teachers and doctors to do their job doesn't only affect the life of Yemenis today, but also threatens the future generation to come. Now, coming back to the United States after elections. In the United States, President-elect Biden, through his electoral pledges, promised Yemenis in the USA, a community that was very active in his historical victory, two things. One, to abolish the unconstitutional Muslim ban, which, as you all know, impact the American Yemeni community the most, contradicting a history of integration and blending with other communities in this great nation of the free. And second, the most important request of Yemenis from the Hill politics in Washington, D.C., to stop the war in Yemen. In March 2021, as the Biden administration spends 100 days in office, the war in Yemen is to enter its 7th year, multiplying the effect of the worst man-made humanitarian crisis in the world, and as a result of the war and famine, potentially claiming the lives of millions of helpless Yemenis. I welcome the Biden commitment to put an end to this war by addressing its regional ramification and to prevent Yemen from falling to the ambitions of Houthi rebels, the Hezbollah, the Iran proxy network, the terrorist group such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the warlords. I would like also, with very cautious note, to express, maybe I disagree slightly with Dr. John Anthony when he mentioned about the priorities. I expressed my understanding that the new administration priorities in international affairs will not have Yemen on top of the list during the first 100 days of office. But I still believe that human suffering, human rights, and freedom, which embody the fundamental values and principles of American democracy, will prevail. And we hope to see Yemen in the agenda of the 100 days, because of its humanitarian character and the famine looming. I disagree with the differing opinion of researchers and analysts concluding that the new administration will have a radical change against Trump foreign policies. I also disagree with those who see Biden approach as a total rejection of Trump approach to the region and as an extension of Obama legacy. I instead believe that Biden's approach will be more pragmatic and would evolve with wisdom and cautiousness to help decipher the regional code, working with historical regional allies in pacifying the volatile Middle East and returning to the core American democratic values in international relations. Of course, there is no way Biden can secure progress toward peace in Yemen through diplomatic regional leverage alone. When the parties on the ground insist on protecting their egoistic interest and maximalist demand, refusing to advance peace or relief of millions of impoverished Yemenis battling with famine and infectious disease. The vast majority of Yemenis just wish to close the bloody chapter of war in Yemen and return to a peaceful country, recovering the legitimate structures of the state and permanently eliminating the militias and warlords from their lives. So what are Biden's options in stopping the war in Yemen? In line with the new administration commitment to strengthening multilateralism, Biden will need to encourage the Security Council to speak in one voice on the Yemeni tragedy, especially after almost 1 year of efforts of the special envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Martin Griffiths, to reach a consensus between the government of Yemen and the Houthis rebels on the joint declaration. A compromise plan which will lead to the national ceasefire, economic and humanitarian measures, the resumption of political consultation on the security and political settlement to reach a sustainable and implementable solution establishing a national unity government. There is an urgent need for both the government and the Houthis to conclude the negotiation on the joint declaration to stop the collapse. As time goes on the conflict in Yemen, the solution becomes more difficult as the parties and actors in the conflict fragment and multiply and state institutions erode. The war economy replaces the national economy, creating more lucrative and attractive incentives for those who want to continue fighting. The longer the Yemeni war goes on its own only, it not only will prolong the suffering of the people, but also it makes it's impossible to reverse the status quo. What are the other options for peace if no successful outcome is achieved through the UN-led process? Other options include reintroducing Secretary Kerry's peace plan of 2016. The Kerry plan was the momentum of the Obama administration, but unfortunately came in the last minute before President Trump took oath of office. Despite the initial urgent call of President Trump in his first months in the Oval Office to end the war in Yemen, internal dynamics and compromises of the Trump administration pushed Yemen war and the world's worst humanitarian crisis to be forgotten and treated with indifference. So what was that message? I remember President Trump sent a message to the coalition, to the Saudis, to the Yemeni government, to the Emiratis, that 6 months will be enough to wrap up this process and end the war. Then what happened? Everybody can understand the way the Trump administration was dealing with international affairs. Also, the Biden administration can revisit the Stockholm Hudaydah plan, which has all the necessary endorsement of the Security Council and all the UN interoperabilities on the ground, including the mandate of the United Nations mission in support of the Hudaydah Agreement, But unfortunately, because the parties, especially the Houthis, failed to understand its pilot project character, was not given enough efforts and time to move forward. Today, the Houthis is still not showing interest, unfortunately, in seeing peace and working for peace through their retaliation in all the battlefronts in Yemen, and also by attacking neighboring countries. They are showing that they are not willing to talk peace. They are not willing to engage in the joint declaration with the UN Special Envoy. What's the meaning of Hodeidah when I'm talking about the pilot project? Every party, especially the Houthis, they thought that the Hodeidah agreement reached in Stockholm, where I was the responsible for that, for the signing of that agreement, they thought it's a victory for them. So claiming victory and never understanding the pilot project that we wanted to create in Hodeidah by just asking the militias to leave the city and the two ports in Ras Isa and Hodeidah, and ask them also to work with institutions within the governorate of Hodeidah and try to strengthen the central bank, the branch of Hodeidah, by working with the central bank in Aden and paying salaries, and all the revenues of the seaport will be in working together, accommodating each other in our country and not outside to work together. But we failed because no one was really interested in this pilot project. And today we have this mission there and doing nothing. Before I end, before I end my intervention, the Biden administration, this is very important, and also Dr. John Duke Anthony mentioned it. Before I end my intervention, the Biden administration should look to Yemen and its crisis as a friendly nation in need, and part of its obligation as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to safeguard peace and stability in the world, and not through the perspective of or interests of other nations in the region and beyond. As Ma'amari mentioned also, it's not through the lenses, not through the eyes of others. And it's the key to a settlement in Yemen. It's very important to de-link the region. Although the region is very important, we will live together for centuries to come. But to solve the crisis is very important to look to Yemen and the Yemeni people. Finally, if we fail to stop the carnage, God forbid, and the momentum that the new administration brings with it, we will come in few years to lament the loss of lives of millions of Yemenis and the total destruction of the beautiful land of Felix Arabia, the cradle of human civilization. Thank you all for your attention.
الأستاذ اليماني يعطيك العافية. Now we can take questions. الأسئلة، عندي سؤالين الموجهين للسيد اليماني. أول سؤال، هل تعتقد أن الحل ممكن أن يكون متاحاً في ظل وجود ميليشيات تحكم البلاد في جنوبه وشماله؟
سأجيب على الأسئلة. ممكن الأخ المعمري، الدكتور المعمري، يسهم في إيضاح الأمر للبقية. النظر إلى تعقيدات الوضع في اليمن قلتها، هناك يعني فرضية ثابتة في القانون الدولي، وهي أن امتداد الحروب الأهلية يجعل العودة إلى السلام والعودة إلى الاقتصاد الطبيعي والعودة إلى الحياة الطبيعية من المستحيل. هناك شعوب عاشت التجربة الصومالية أمامنا، لا زالت تعاني بعد سنوات طويلة من الحرب. القول بأننا لا نستطيع أن نتحاور مع إرهابيين ولا مع عصابات ولا مع ميليشيات في الشمال أو في الجنوب هو فيه الكثير من هذا وطننا. ينبغي أن نبحث عن الحلول التي تعيدنا إلى وطننا وتعيد تماسك اللحظة الوطنية. كيف يتم ذلك؟ هناك مزيج. جربنا 6 سنوات من الحرب. 6 سنوات من الحرب أوصلتنا إلى حالة من الإنهاك، أوصلتنا إلى استقرار ولعبة تبادل المواقع في هذه الحرب، والتي هي يعني قاتلة الشعب اليمني، منهكة للقدرات. وحقيقة يوصلنا، أنا قدمت صورة اقتصادية أعتقد أنها مأساوية، أن ترى الناس في اليمن لا تحصل على $1.50 لقوت يومها، وهناك الكثيرين ممن يموتون جوعا في المدن والقرى اليمنية في مختلف المناطق. فأنا أرى أننا ينبغي، أنا لست داعية حرب، أنا رجل سلام، كل خبرتي في العمل القانوني الدولي وفي العلاقات الدولية، وأرى أن السلام ممكنا. ولهذا ضمن المخارج التي استعرضتها أرى أنه بالإمكان، هناك الكثير من الخيارات أمامنا للجلوس والضغط على الميليشيات للجلوس من أجل إحلال السلام. بالنسبة لموضوع الجنوب، هذا موضوع معقد، هناك يعني كثير من الشرح حول تعقيداته، ولا ينبغي أن يقارن بالضبط مثل هي المقارنة الموجودة مع الميليشيات الحوثية في صنعاء.
دكتور المعمري معنا؟
نعم.
بس إذا كان بالإمكان أنه الإجابة على السؤال، ترجمة الإجابة.
Okay, the question was to Dr. Al-Yemeni if he believes that the political compromise or settlement is possible under the rule of the militia in Yemen, either in the north or in the south. Dr. Al-Yemeni, he explained that we tried about 6 years of wars. Why don't we try another solution, which is the peace solution? He said we have many experiences, especially like the Somalia and other countries. They were under the same, maybe similar situation, but they find at the end a way for a peace. Yemeni, they live a tragic humanitarian situation. They have to find a way or a solution for a peace. He believes that peace is possible. There are many options to reach this peace with the Houthis. But on the other hand, the southern issue is different from the Houthi issue and should be dealt differently. This is what he mentioned.
Thank you. One more question for Ustad Al-Yemeni. You were a former foreign affairs for Yemen. How do you see the current situation for the current government? Would the current government provide any solution for Yemen people? كنت وزير الخارجية اليمنية، كيف ترى وضع الحكومة؟ وهل من الممكن أن تقدم شيئا للشعب اليمني أم أنها أصبحت رهينة للحلفاء؟
هذا سؤال في منتهى الأهمية. نحن ليس لدينا حكومة حقيقة منذ أكثر من عام، ونحن نسعى لتشكيل حكومة. وبفعل الجهود التي قام بها التحالف بقيادة المملكة العربية السعودية، تم الاتفاق بين الحكومة اليمنية الشرعية وبين المجلس الانتقالي من أجل تشكيل حكومة والتعايش. هذا الذي تحدثت عنه، أن القوى السياسية والمشاركين والأطراف يتشظوا، يتحولون، بدل من أن يكونوا طرفا اليوم سيتحولون في الغد إلى 20 طرف. سنجد أنفسنا في الشرعية هناك 20 طرف يمثلنا، وفي الواقع هناك الآن أكثر من طرف في المكونات. فهناك الساحل الغربي تحت سيطرة طرف ليس جزءا من الشرعية، وهناك يعني تعقيدات المسألة. ولهذا قررت الشرعية بوضعها الضعيف هذا أن تدخل في هذا التحالف الذي لم يؤتي ثماره حتى الآن، ولم تشكل حكومة. ومن يدفع الثمن؟ الشعب اليمني الذي يدفع الثمن معاناة يومية في الخدمات، يدفع الثمن معاناة يومية في غياب كما أن غياب الحكومة وعدم تواجدها في الداخل اليمني يعني يسقط عنها الكثير من المصداقية، ويسقط عنها الكثير من التعاطي من قبل مكونات المجتمع المحلي والمجتمع الدولي. فهذا الأمر حقيقة شيء محزن. ولكن أنا أرى أننا إذا أردنا أن نستعيد وطننا وأردنا أن نتفاوض على وطننا، فلنعد جميعا إلى الداخل هناك حيث نعيش معاناة شعبنا ونطعم مرارة العيش اليومية حتى نستعيد وطننا. لا نستعيد وطننا ونحن يعني مرفهين، ينبغي أن نستعيد وطننا. لهذا أرى أن من كل من يريد أن يعمل في الخدمة العامة اليوم أن يفكر في تبعات ما يجري في اليمن وخطورة ذلك على الإنسان وعلى الأهل.
نعم، شكرا لك دكتور المعمري. إذا بالإمكان الترجمة الإجابة من فضلك.
He said that we are living for about 1 year without any government actually. And this is what he also emphasized in his presentation, that the fragmentation of the main players will complicate the situation in Yemen. We have now different players and parties in Yemen. The coalition didn't help to achieve the settlement after about 6 years. And he added also that being the government and the president being outside the Yemen didn't help also to reach the settlement. To restore the country, we have to return back all of us to the country, to inside the country, and from there we can negotiate and find the solution to restore the country. Yes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Anthony, do you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah, hello. Will we see a direct U.S. involvement in Yemen?
What do I see regarding the U.S. involvement in Yemen?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the involvement has been heavily at the humanitarian level. For example, there are around half a dozen American humanitarian groups that have been involved in Yemen and want to remain involved in Yemen. They want to even be strengthened and expanded in Yemen. And they're very worried that if the Houthis are declared a foreign terrorist organization, the United States will be the only one to do that. And this will make it possible to criminalize or have punitive responses and consequences to anyone who works with and through the Houthis, even to provide humanitarian aid. So we're talking about Oxfam America. We're talking about Mercy Corps America. We're talking about CARE Corporation. We're talking about Save the Children's Fund. We're talking about the International Rescue Committee. That's 5 right there. These are enormous organizations. They're respected worldwide. They have great legitimacy, great experience, and they work with compassion in their heads, in their hearts, and on their sleeves. This is an American involvement in Yemen of a different kind. With regard to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. has been providing refueling capabilities for Saudi Arabia's aircraft that have been bombing infrastructure and other sites in Yemen. It's been providing intelligence for the armed forces intruding in Yemen. These aspects, plus a focus on trying to find a formula, a face-saving formula that will bring an end to this conflict. But as His Excellency Ambassador Al-Yemeni mentioned, this must be near the top of the priority of the Biden administration. But it has to face realities. Of course, we all want democratic principles to prevail, but the United States does not have, and Yemen has no interest in being involved in an issue like this that is emotional to begin with, and is also hypocritical. Twice in the last, well, actually 3 times in the last 20 years in the United States, you've had national presidential elections where the person who got the most votes came and lost in 2 of the cases, in 2001 and in 2016. And in this one, the results were contested. 70 million people voted for the loser, and the loser refuses to concede. So this is of enormous importance. And if Pompeo has his way with the summit in Riyadh and getting Saudi Arabia's, accepting Saudi Arabia's pressure on the United States and the UAE's pressure on the United States to declare the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. This will be a setback. And the question is, who gains? Where's the benefit? It's a political act to do this. But to undo it is enormously complicated. The phrase is worth pondering, that it takes a human being to proclaim sanctions on a country, but to undo the sanctions takes an act of God. It's a challenge for the bureaucracy, for the lawyers, for the administration, and it takes a large amount of time. Look at how long we've had sanctions on Iran since 1979. And look what's happened. Iran has only grown. Yes, of course, its economy is suffering massively. Its economy has been devastated, and it's isolated in many cases more than it wants to be. And yet, in spite of all that, Iran has been on a roll and run. It has a straight geopolitical, geostrategic highway from Tehran to the Eastern Mediterranean. And this has not been the case in 6,000 years. So sanctions can backfire. And look at the sanctions on Cuba, just 90 miles off of Americans' shore.
Yeah.
It has not done anything to change really the fundamental behavior of the Cuban regimes. So sanctions are something that the United States must be very careful using as a tool and try a different approach to engage the parties politically. It's one thing when Trump became president to go to Riyadh. That was his first international visit. Imagine what would be the effect if Biden went to Sana'a instead of Riyadh or Abu Dhabi.
Let us go to Dr. Abdurrahman al-Ma'mari to translate your answer, and I have another question for you after the translation.
Sure.
Ma'mari.
اوكي I'm there.
تفضل.
كان السؤال عن التواجد الامريكي في القضيه اليمنيه، فكان الجواب ان هناك تواجد في الجانب الانساني، والمنظمات الامريكيه هناك العديد منها موجود على الساحه اليمنيه، وهي تتزايد وتتوسع مع مرور الايام. لكنه قال ان اعلان الحوثي كمنظمه ارهابيه هو مبعث قلق لهذه المنظمات، حيث أن هذا الإعلان سوف يجرم هذه المنظمات. طبعا هي تعمل في مناطق سيطرة الحوثي وتعمل يعني بالتنسيق معه، لذلك أي عمل سيكون مع الحوثي كمنظمة إرهابية سوف يجرم هذه الأعمال حتى على مستوى الأعمال الإنسانية. وهناك العديد من المنظمات البارزة التي ذكرها كالأوكسفام وسيف شولدرن وبقية المنظمات البارزة في الأعمال الإنسانية. بالنسبة للعلاقة ووجود الولايات المتحدة مع السعودية، فهناك تعاون عسكري، وهناك أيضا تعاون استخباراتي كما قال بين الدولتين. لابد من وجود صياغة مناسبة لحل هذا الصراع. هذه هي الرؤية التي يراها هناك. الرؤية الحالية بفرض العقوبات والمزيد من العقوبات كما يراها المتحدث أنها ليست دائما تحقق أهدافها، والأمثلة الموجودة هي تجربتهم مع إيران وكذلك تجربتهم مع كوبا. لذلك لابد من التفكير بحلول أخرى.
شكرا دكتور. Dr. Anthony, another question, I think it's related a little bit to the first question, or the answer will be related to. The question is, what are the concrete steps Yemenis should take to end the war and bring about peace? How could Yemenis rally to support and the attention of the world and the pro-democracy countries, and in particular light of the Biden administrations?
Yes, well, this is a tough one because you can approach it idealistically or realistically. And idealistically is self-satisfying emotionally and maybe even ideologically in terms of principles or even one's religious faith. But it also can be disastrous. Reality is reality, and reality has to do with facts, and facts are stubborn things. If you want to resolve this, you have to engage all of the parties, and all of the parties that have a stake in this, and you cannot avoid dealing with the Houthis. The strategic interest should be peace, not war. Should be security, not insecurity. Should be stability, not instability. Yemen is an enormously important country. Look at its geography. On the northwest quadrant of the Indian Ocean, the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. This is of importance of more than Yemen. It is to the world. 1/3 of all of the oil that comes out of the Gulf goes through the Bab el-Mandeb to Western markets. So one can say, oh, no, you cannot deal with such an extremist organization. Well, if you cannot deal with it, this is a guarantee for the perpetuation of the conflict, the continuation of it. Look, in the case of Vietnam, the United States insisted that the Viet Cong in North Vietnam must recognize the Republic of South Vietnam in order to end the war. The Viet Cong said, hell no. North Vietnam, Hanoi said, hell no. And the United States sat with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese in Paris for months on end to finally bring an end to that crisis. Had it prevailed on its ideological, political, principled insistence, the United States would still be there. There'd still be the 1.3 million Vietnamese who were killed and the 58,000 Americans killed.
Will be any serious steps from Biden's administration to do in Yemen, or it will continue the system like started before? Just
no,
Iran or the situation is really complicated to explain all aspects, I understand, and to get it in one answer. But we need to satisfy the audience with a little bit of clear answers if that would help. So do you think Biden's administration will make any change in their policies in their time or not?
Yes, they will try, and they will have congressional support for this. But trying is one thing, dealing with the consequences is another. You have to face the consequences here, truth and consequences. And if the consequences make the situation worse, then you have to ask the question, why are you going to have a set of policies and positions that make a situation worse?
Okay.
If you're really serious about peace, then you have to deal with all the parties that have an interest, a stake in the peace. You can invite them to Camp David, or you can invite them to Geneva, or you can invite them to Sweden, any place there. But meet with them and not stop meeting
al-Ma'mari to translate this very important answer, because we expanded the answer. So Dr. al-Ma'mari, please.
أوكي، شكرا. كان السؤال: ما هي الخطوات العملية التي يجب على اليمنيين اتخاذها؟ وكذلك هل هناك أي خطوات جادة متوقعة من الحكومة الأمريكية تحت إدارة الرئيس المنتخب بايدن؟ فبداية كما ذكر المتحدث، وهذا سؤال صعب ويمكن النظر إليه من زاويتين، من الزاوية المثالية أو من الزاوية الواقعية. فمثاليا أو عاطفيا أو حتى من الناحية العقائدية، يعني بالإمكان أن تكون هناك خطوات، لكن النتائج سوف تكون كارثية. أما إذا ما كان النظر إلى هذا الأمر من الناحية الواقعية، والواقع هو الذي يتحدث عن الحقائق، فستكون نتائج مختلفة. ورؤيته هنا هو اشتراك جميع الأطراف دون استثناء للجلوس وللنقاش والحوار. وفي هذه الحالة لا يمكن تجنب التعامل مع الحوثي حتى يشترك في هذا الحوار. كما قال، البلد مهم جدا، اليمن بلد مهم جدا بالنظر إلى موقعه الاستراتيجي، مضيق باب المندب، البحر الأحمر وغيره. حوالي ثلث الإنتاج العالمي من النفط يمر عبر باب المندب إلى الأسواق الغربية. فكل هذا يجعل اليمن بلد في غاية الأهمية. ذكر مثال على الحلول الواقعية بما حصل في فيتنام. ثم كان سؤال اللاحق هناك: هل تتوقع أن تكون هناك خطوات جادة من الحكومة الأمريكية تحت إدارة بايدن؟ فقال هنا أنهم سوف يحاولون، لكن المحاولة شيء والتعامل مع العواقب شيء آخر. بإمكان الإدارة الأمريكية من ضمن الحلول دعوة جميع الأطراف إلى جلسات حوارية سواء في كامب ديفيد أو في جنيف أو في أي مكان آخر للجلوس والتفاوض مع بعض.
لو كنانة
تفضل. كان في سؤال لك بس تفضل.
نعم وبعدين نستمع للسؤال. Let me just precise something very important on the designation. The designation in international law is more complication than solution. The designation should not be a light issue to deal with. I mean, it's what will happen if we designate the Houthis as a terrorist group? We put them in the administration list, then we take them to the UN, what we call it, unified list. Then what will happen? How this will impact the end of the war in Yemen or the life of Yemenis? Is there any change? If there is any change, I will be the first supporter of the listing. And I'm telling you, I'm an expert in international law. I'm not just a propaganda. I'm not repeating what I see in the region talking, list the Houthis as a terrorist group. And I mean, it looks very easy from outside. Yes. But once you go and take about the repercussion of that, the impact of that on the population is miserable, I'm telling you. That's yes. Why the only solution for us is to engage the Houthis and try to explain to them that this is our land, this is our country, we can survive together. What we ask them to do is to recover the legitimate structures of government. We cannot accept that Hezbollah control Yemen. Lebanon is an example, is a lost country where Hezbollah is defining the daily life of Lebanese. We can't do that in Yemen, but we want to live with them in peace. We want them to have a political party. We want them to have their own agenda and defend their agenda. I will be the first one in supporting their right to express themselves. But I cannot accept them to control the faith of my nation as Hezbollah or Iran or even other countries in the region. I can't accept. Yemen should be looked as a country, a nation that want to survive together in a federal structure. The best option for Yemenis, whatever is best for Yemenis, we will take it. But we cannot take it that the Houthis decide and dictate our faith. Thank you.
Very good. I agree.
Dr. Anthony, you want to add something?
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
If you bring the Houthis and the players to Geneva or Sweden or Washington, wherever, you can do as Saudi Arabia did in the Taif Accord to end the civil war in Lebanon, which started in January 1975. It went to 1989. Saudi Arabia invited all of the players to Taif. And then once they were there, said, you are not going to be allowed to leave until and unless you settle this conflict. And they did. Of course, it became the name of the game for Lebanon for the next almost 20 years. But the ambassador's right, Lebanon is a failed state now, it's fallen apart. But you ended that civil war that way. And if you want to end the civil war in Yemen, that is a way to do it, to bring all of the parties together and saying you're not leaving until there is a workable peace agreement, not just rhetorical, not just on paper, not just with signatures, but a plan to implement it on the ground. Otherwise, it'll just be kalam fadi, or empty rhetoric.
Let's go before, because we are in limited time right now. Let's go to Dr. Al-Ma'mari to translate. This is very important answer as well. And interview, please, Dr. Al-Ma'mari, تفضل.
كانت مداخلة الدكتور اليماني حول تصنيف الحوثي كمنظمة إرهابية، وكان يرى أن هذا الأمر يعني في غاية الصعوبة، ولا بد أن ننظر إلى عواقب هذا الأمر، والحل هو في إشراك الحوثي في المفاوضات ومحاولة أن يشرح اليمنيين له أن هذه أرضنا وهذه بلدنا وهذه يعني لا بد أن نتقاسم أو لا بد أن نعيش مع بعض في هذا البلد. ومن ناحية أخرى فاليمنيين لا يقبلوا حزب الله آخر في بلدهم، يمكن أن يعطوا حق تشكيل الحزب السياسي، أن يعبروا عن رأيهم، لكن لا يتحكموا في مصائر الناس في اليمن. الحل هو أن يعيش اليمنيين في بلد في يمن اتحادي يسعى أو يشترك فيه الجميع. مداخلة السيد أنطوني كانت حول يعني استذكار يعني أو جلب مثال اتفاق الطائف كما فعلت السعودية مع الفرقاء والمختلفين في لبنان، فقد تكون هناك تجربة مماثلة للمتصارعين في اليمن.
شكرا. The last question for Mr. Khalid al-Yamani. Do you think President Hadi and his government, when they return back to Yemen, would help to end this war? Please, in a few words لو سمحت لي نحصل أيضا على حق الترجمة من
through our historical experience. The Republicans and the Royalists fought each other in the north for quite a long time also. And what happened in the end? They were in Yemen, they were fighting in Yemen, and they sit together and they worked a deal to live together. And the Royalists came back and were part in the formation of the government. And President Hadi, I remember in the beginning, I remember a few years in 2015, we were discussing that. And he was telling his American counterpart, look, don't think that we are not negotiating in backstage with the Houthis, because this is our country and we can't do it like the Royalists and the Republicans did in the 60s. And really, I'm telling you, the only way that we need to sit down in our country in any, constructive environment to work to strike out that deal. There's no way for us to continue. I don't want to look repetitive. I don't want to come, if we now talk about listing and putting the Houthis and we will not talk peace, we need to finish the Houthis because we can't do it. This is the warlord language. They are keeping saying that we have a chance. We need only ammunitions, some arms, and all. We will defeat them. We are almost. This almost took us 6 years. I don't want to see another almost to take us another 6 years. And in 12 years, we come and lament the life of Yemenis, millions of Yemenis. We are facing famine. And people are still questioning, no, it's not famine. This is a rhetoric of the UN. No, we are facing famine. The country is facing famine. Do you know what's the meaning of that? If we don't have urgent supplies today, if the UN humanitarian relief operations are not taking place today, we will see people by hundreds, by thousands, by millions dying. And people just look at it lightly and thinking, no, this is a rhetoric of the UN. I'm telling you, we need to look for the solution. And Dr. John Duke Anthony, he just mentioned few. We have the joint declaration, and this is one of the options I mentioned. I mentioned the first option. We have already a document ready to go. Why we don't approve it now? We are working with this document for 1 year almost. The special envoy of the Secretary General is moving from here and there and trying to virtually to talk to the parties. We have a document. It's not the brilliant document, but it's a base to talk. We can together. We spent almost 4 months in Kuwait, and we were there almost. We were there, and we had a deal ready in Kuwait. Then what happened? Everybody ran away, and and every 2 years, if you see 6 years, in the first 2 years we attempted peace, and we waited. Then we kept silent, and the second 2 years, I was the end of the second 2 years with the Stockholm Agreement, where the agreement that I was a participant and I was leading the negotiation. And now after 2 years, we have the joint declaration. Are we willing also to wait another 2 years? People are not interested. Yemen is a poor country. We don't have a strategic, merchandise, or we are very, very lucrative and attractive to the world. We are a nation, impoverished nation. That's why I call upon the obligations in international law of the Biden administration to look into their obligation as permanent member of the Security Council to safeguard peace and security in the world. And Yemen is one of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let's go back to our great translator, Dr. Mahmari. So please, thank you so much. تفضل دكتور.
الدكتور اليماني كان يعني يعيد نفس النقاط التي ذكرها. هناك تجربة تاريخية في اليمن عن تجربة الجمهوريين والملكيين والمحادثات التي يعني خاضوها في الستينات حتى وصلوا إلى حل في الأخير ما بين المتحاربين في ذلك الوقت. يقول أنه يعني الآن ما هو مطروح على الطاولة هو الإعلان المشترك، وهو ثمرة جهود كبيرة خلال الفترة الماضية. رفض مثل هذه الاتفاقيات قد يؤدي إلى إطالة أمد الحرب. قد لا يكون هذا الإعلان المشترك هو الإعلان المثالي أو الممتاز في هذه المرحلة، لكن يمكن استخدامه كأساس تفاوضي للأطراف المختلفة. هذا ممكن مختصر ما أتفضل به.
شكرا لك. شكرا لكل المستمعين، شكرا لكل الذين تواجدوا معنا اليوم، شكرا لضيوفنا الكرام الذين حضروا، شكرا للمترجم، شكرا لكل من قام على هذه الندوة وعمل على إنجاحها. وأعتذر من سأل ولضيق الوقت لم أستطع أخذ كل الأسئلة. I would like to thank everyone who participated with us, our great speakers, our great translator, and people who support this webinar. Thank you so much, and I apologize for not taking extra questions for our tight time. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in another webinar very soon. شكرا لكم.
Thank you.
شكرا.
Yes.